In this video we want to talk about globalization. Now it's quite a long video, so I expect you to stop it and rewind and make notes and wind forward and backwards as you wish. So don't perhaps attempt it all in one move. It's 82 slides, as you can see from the bottom right. But nonetheless, these are important topics, ones that are discussed often in the media and ones that we should be aware of. So let's look at globalization and see what these issues are. Let's start with the definition. Globalization describes a process by which regional economies, societies and cultures have become integrated through a global network of communications, transportation and trade. And that comes from Wikipedia. It's a very comprehensive definition. It's one which addresses most of the items that we would associate with globalization. When we think of the word globalization, we do think of regional economies and societies and cultures all coming together and integrating and being in contact with the other side of the world and other cultures and using communications and transport and trade and so on. We do think of this. Maybe overall we think of it in terms of economics and trading, because that seems to be uppermost in the minds of many people when they think of globalization. But there are many factors to take into account. Let's just run through some of the terms that are often associated with globalization. Just look at the terms. We won't discuss them in any detail. We'll go on to discuss other things in the course of this talk. But let's have a look at some of the ideas. So we'll start. Globalization. We normally think of issues of accountability. How do we control globalization? And outsourcing, that's a term associated as well. A company outsourcing its production or part of its tasks to companies elsewhere. We think of capitalism and the spread of capitalism throughout the world. Perhaps in the past the world was more separated out by ideology. Capitalism on the one side and communism on the other, and various mutations almost in between, different types, different views of capitalism, different views of communism. But there seems to be an overwhelming interest now in this idea of trade and capitalism throughout the world. That's the way the world has turned. We think of economic growth being fueled by globalization, and we think of how interconnected economies are. If China suffers a downturn right now, we all suffer. In the past, if China experienced a downturn, it didn't matter to the people in the West. They didn't experience anything. They may have felt sorry it was going through a bad period, but it didn't affect them. But now it does. Now it affects all of us. China currently is the second largest economy in the world. We look at the environment and look at all of the issues associated with the environment and the impact of globalization on the environment. There's a case to be answered that sometimes companies in the West, to try and meet regulatory standards in the West, to meet obligations for treaties on climate change and on cleaning up the environment and so on, these companies have, in a sense, exported their pollution to other countries. And other countries, desperate for jobs, desperate for work creation, have accepted those industries. So we find the pollution has simply moved from one country to another, the sources of pollution. Not always the case, but some people make the point. We also hear all the time about problems of exploitation, people working for little or nothing in sweatshops and producing luxury items for sale in the West, and people in the West go and buy fashion clothing that have been produced by people working in factories that are under appalling conditions for very little return. So we think of exploitation. It's a word associated with globalization. When we think of globalization, it's a word that may come to mind. We certainly think of the world as shrinking. We now think of the world as quite a small place. This is probably a function of communications and the internet and so on. But also in terms of economics, when we buy a product in a shop, we shouldn't be surprised, and we're not generally surprised anymore, to find it's come in from someplace in Africa or in South America or in the Far East or wherever. And sometimes we can buy tropical fruit in excellent condition in supermarkets that's come all the way from the other side of the world. So it's a shrinking world. So it's shrinking because of, as I said, technology, the internet, communications, those sort of things are affecting the way we see the world. But they're all linked to this idea of globalization. When we think of the word globalization, we start to think of all of these different points. We think of terrorism, unfortunately, globalization. There are conflicts in the world now that in the past we were not aware of. Now these conflicts seem to involve us. Again, it's because it's on the news and because we're aware of it, more aware of it than ever before. And economies seem to be linking together. They seem to be getting connected together. Companies operate in one country, they have branches in another country, so much so that there's so much contact between the various companies in one country to another country, the two countries almost are connected. And the governments of both countries must take each other into account in their dealings. It may be a good thing. Maybe it'll stop conflict. We also think of free trade and the issues of free trade and trying to get free trade in the world. And maybe we have globalization because free trade has become more acceptable. But of course, free trade means jobs are created in one place and perhaps lost in another place. So there are adjustments associated with free trade. We think of monopoly power. We think of large companies operating in different markets and the dominance of some companies as they come to be. Because a company working in a small country who decides to, in a sense, globalize, in a sense to take some of its production or its production techniques and into a bigger, much more sophisticated, much more complicated society. If it manages to set up there and be successful, it's got a much bigger consumer base. So the company may become extremely large. If it stayed where it was, it would always be a small company or a medium-sized company. We think of culture, and now business people have to take culture into account. In the past, they took economics into account. They took the price and perhaps some element of marketing and so on. Now, they must be aware of what's acceptable and not acceptable in different societies. And this overlaps with brands, the brands that are promoted. And there seems to be a very shrinking world, a very small world in some respects. When we travel from one country to another, we see the same brands. We see the same products. We go into shops and we see the same products. It's like we'd never left home sometimes. So it's brand recognition that's the issue, and the brands themselves, they're physically there. We recognize them as well because we are as a traveller, perhaps, we have moved from one country to another and we see the same items for sale. We also think of poverty when we think of globalization. We think of people working for almost nothing and people in desperate situations trying to make a living, trying to feed their families. And we see this. We see it on television. We're more conscious of it. We're more aware of it. And this links to trade and aid. Trading with the country, trying to promote jobs and promote prosperity. And also, because we're more aware of what's going on in the country, there are issues associated with foreign aid. Countries giving other countries resources to try and help them to develop and help them look after their people. But we're also aware of issues like equality and inequality. For example, the rights of women in some countries, or the rights of children in some countries. Perhaps some countries don't have proper education systems and the children have to work from an early age. Well, this happened in the UK back in the 1700s and 1800s when the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Children had to work from early ages because of poverty. Now we see it 200, almost 300 years on. We see it in other countries and we can relate to it. And we try to make people aware of the need to improve education, to improve opportunities, and to try and help people to develop. So there are many issues, just looking at the diagram, many words almost, many issues and many words and many expressions that we associate with globalization. And when we think of the word globalization, these may come to mind. These are the sort of ideas that come to our mind. Perhaps not all at once, but these are the sort of things we would start to think about. Let's talk about some in particular and go through the rest of this video. Let's talk about the integration of economies. Well, there's an increasing reliance of economies on each other. The problem is that economies are linked. It's not perhaps a problem, it's only a problem if politicians and the business community see it as a problem. But economies are becoming linked through trade connections. And there's a greater, perhaps it's a good thing because it reduces conflict and it promotes understanding, but the economies are starting to get interconnected. So we start to think of autonomy, individual governments taking individual policy measures for their country. That day is seemingly passing. Now countries have to take other countries into account as well. The opportunities to be able to buy and sell in any country in the world, that's what we mean by integration of economies. It means economies are coming closer together so companies can easily set up and trade in other countries. And it's a two-way thing. We get companies in the West investing in China, but we get companies from China investing in the West. It's two-way. The West invests in China, and China invests in the West. There are opportunities for labour and capital to locate elsewhere in the world. People can move from perhaps one country to another. Their skills are relevant. The companies that produce the products perhaps have moved there already, so they have a chance of getting a similar job in the other country. And there's the growth of global markets in finance. We now know that if the stock exchange in Shanghai dips, if the index falls there, it may have an impact on Wall Street or in London. So markets are interconnected. So the world is changing. We're moving from almost from nation states, from separate countries. We're starting to get interconnected through economic contact. Companies setting up in other countries, forming links with the home country, and there's a connection. Workers are starting to learn new practices in other countries, and companies who go there are starting to learn the problems and issues of dealing with another culture and looking at opportunities available there. And also finance markets who value the companies that are involved in global trade. The finance markets are interconnected. So all in all, the world is changing quite rapidly. Now, the integration of economies is made possible by technology. And by technology, I suppose what we mean really is communications networks and internet access. Technology has improved immensely over the last, say, 20 years and is continuing to increase almost at an accelerating rate. So there are more opportunities for better communications between companies, between buyers and sellers, between countries. And it's cheap communications. Once the hardware is in place, the contacts are cheap. So it's possible for companies to teleconference each other and deal with issues, and they're able to place orders for raw materials and supplies and components and talk about designs. The contact is high quality, but it's also quite cheap. So economies are becoming integrated because of the impact of technology. But it's also the growth of economic cooperation. There's development of trade blocs or trading blocs. For example, the European Union, there's the North American Free Trade Association, and there's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN, NAFTA, EU. All of these are trying to reduce the obstacles to trade, trying to promote economic well-being and promote it within their own blocks and from their own blocks into other areas of the world. So there is greater economic cooperation in the world as well as better technology, which both foster integration. There's also the collapse of communism. Communism was a way of looking at the economic system in terms of the dominance of the government and the need of the government to produce everything. Produce consumer goods, produce capital goods, produce the services such as education, health, housing, roads, streetlights. The communist ideal was the state would own everything and produce everything. But that meant limited choice for customers. And eventually customers and consumers and families, they wanted more. They wanted better lives. And they saw what was happening in the so-called capitalist world in the West. They saw people driving big cars and living in nice houses and having holidays and flying around the world, and they wanted the same, quite naturally. So communism collapsed. So there's not so much a debate about communism and capitalism anymore. Now there are debates about regional issues and religious issues and cultural issues. There are all sorts of debates that have sprung up to replace the old debate between capitalism and communism. But economies seem to become integrated because there is no, in a sense, economic debate. There is no big ideological divide. Countries want development, and countries seem to be willing to accept the capitalist mode of thinking. So there's a movement to free trade. Countries want free trade. And sometimes countries want it because they are underdeveloped, their workers are not paid very much, and they know that the output from their factories will be cheap compared to companies in the West, so they have a competitive advantage. Clearly, as development equalizes later, then there will be more internal trading. So it's happening in China at the moment. China deals a lot with the outside world. It's a very open economy in that sense. But it's also developing an internal market, which is massive because of the number of people there. And that's become important to the Chinese economy. Now, there's always a debate between trade and aid. Well, the benefits of trade. For a start, there's increased choice. When we have trade, we have a better range of products. And customers and consumers like that. And we like to go into the shop and see we could have this or we could have that, and it's nice. If we just have one item to select, it's restricted choice. And we're not very happy about that. We like the idea of trade. We benefit from trade because we have more choice. But there's also greater potential for growth because with trade, companies can see opportunities, perhaps in overseas markets, and they can then set up in those markets to try and fill that need. So there's greater potential for corporate growth. And corporate growth can lead to greater employment domestically and greater domestic growth. Or it may simply be the case that companies don't set up overseas, they simply produce it domestically and export it because they want to benefit from the trade with another society, another country. There is an increase in economies of scale. Economies of scale means economies of size. As companies get bigger, they are more efficient, up to a certain size. After a while, they can get too big. But companies may get more efficient because they're able to negotiate discounts on purchases, have better relationships with their suppliers, better supply chain management, better production, more specialized machines. They're treated more favorably by the bank. So as companies get bigger, they enjoy all of these advantages. Of course, after a while, the company can get too big, so it's difficult to control the company. It's difficult for the management to know exactly what's happening everywhere within the company. So there may be diseconomies of scale, diseconomies of size. But for small companies or medium-sized companies, the opportunities to grow because of international trade are immense, because they will then benefit from economies of scale, economies of size. They're growing corporate entities. They have more clout in the market. They will have better access to resources from the banks, and they'll have a better reputation in the market. They'll be more widely understood and recognized. So increased economies of scale due to trade. People benefit because there are more employment opportunities, because as companies make products for sale overseas, more workers are required. And even if the company sets up a branch overseas to produce overseas, it'll still need personnel to go there to set up the company, to train the local workers and to be involved and to deal with the company domestically. So all in all, there are greater employment opportunities as a consequence of trade. And now the disadvantages of trade. Well, there is an increasing gap between rich and poor. Whether that should be an issue or not in the context of what we're discussing is debatable. Companies benefit from trade, as I said, and people benefit from trade. It's just that some areas are not, in a sense, ready to reap the benefits from the trade. Some countries are blighted by civil strife, by war, by poor management, by corruption amongst its leadership and politicians debating issues, or there may be religious issues and religious fighting and problems. So in a sense, those people are going to get left behind. Their focus is not on economics and on trade and on development. Their focus is on other issues. Or it may be that some countries simply are so poor in terms of resources, they have never developed. They don't have a proper education system, they don't have a proper healthcare system, their life expectancy is short. To deal with that may need aid, not globalized industry. It may need countries to tax their taxpayers more and give that money to other countries to try and get them to develop, to help their poor. Now that's controversial. Many people would disagree with what I've just said. And we're not here to debate the rights and wrongs of it. I'm just simply saying it may be the case that people in some countries are not capable of reaping the benefits from international trade. What they need instead is aid to get them started, so they have health and they have education, and when they've got both of those in place, then perhaps they are ready to engage in work and in developing their economies. Some writers think that the dominance of global trade by rich Northern Hemisphere countries is bad. Um, but that's where the resources were. That's where the companies were placed. So the companies could not come from someplace else. Uh, there are different emphases in the way countries approach international trade and aid. Currently in Africa, America is putting a lot into welfare programs and into health programs. China is putting a lot into Africa in terms of infrastructure, railways, roads, production facilities. Maybe both ends will join up here. Maybe in the end, the people of Africa will benefit as the consequence of two big superpowers trying to help out. But there again, other people would say, well, perhaps the Americans and the Chinese are doing this with a purpose in mind, that they want cheap labor and they want to tap into the resources of Africa. So it's always a big debate. It's always complicated. The lack of opportunities for the poor may be able to have the poor to have access to markets. Well, that applies in rich countries the same as in poor countries. Poor people in rich countries are poor, the same as poor people in poor countries. There may be a scale of difference, but essentially poor people are poor people, and they need support perhaps to be able to accommodate the changes that are happening around them and to participate so that they can earn a living. So there is a lack of opportunities for the poor to be able to access markets. People living in some areas, because of the remoteness of where they live and because of poor communications channels, they're not able to get their products to market. So they can't tap into any benefits from trade. There is the possible exploitation of workers and growers. We've seen on television people working in sweatshops producing luxury items for the West, fashion items or sports items, making footballs or whatever. And they're only paid a very small sum of money, barely enough to feed them. And in the West, we like the idea of getting these products cheap. Well, there's the problem. We want cheap items. We think that's the benefits of globalization. But when we look deeper into where the products are coming from and why they're cheap, we find that there are people who are, in a sense, out of economic necessity, working for very little, working long hours, perhaps some under dangerous conditions. We know that growers of some crops, say coffee and some other crops, they get very little for their efforts. And what we pay for coffee and items such as coffee in supermarkets and in shops is a lot more. So somewhere in between what we pay and what the growers receive, someone is getting a lot of money. So we could say there are disadvantages to trade. Or at least there are not the big advantages that we were projecting earlier. All of these points are debatable, and all of them, evidence to the contrary can be produced. This is what is often mentioned on the news, on television, and the media. These are the points that often get considered, and until there are clear answers to these issues will remain on the table. These issues will continue to be discussed. We also have multinational corporations. These are sometimes referred to as transnational corporations. These are businesses with headquarters in one country, but with business operations in a number of others. Multinational corporations really span the world. Some of the big companies are just about in every country. They have operations in different countries, and they would say that they need this because they need to pick up on local conditions, on culture, on political change, on developments within different countries, so they can fine-tune their own operations to match what's happening in the country. And there is nothing per se wrong with companies having presence in many countries. It just means we are now dealing with corporations that are extremely big, that are truly global, and are operating in many markets. So let's talk about corporate expansion for a moment. For a start, let's look at the characteristics of corporate expansion. There's increased corporate revenue. When companies move into other countries and set up production facilities and start producing in other countries, they're doing it for a purpose. They're doing it to increase revenue. So each country they go into, they're increasing their revenue. So globally, they have increasing corporate revenue. So they are becoming extremely large. They're also lowering their costs using cheap labour and little planning regulations in some countries. Some countries just welcome the inward investment. They like companies going there, and they don't have planning regulations the same as other countries, perhaps the same as in the West. So companies are able to produce much cheaper in those countries. So if they've got increasing revenue and reducing costs, it must mean higher profits. It's also possible that they can get raw materials cheaper as well. Some countries have an abundance, given the fact that we are running out of a lot of raw materials on the planet because there are so many of us living on the planet, and that's all we've got is this one little planet, as I've said in other videos. But companies like the idea of being present in a country that seems to have an abundance of a certain raw material. They go there and they process it in situ. They process it where it is. Companies also tend to have control over their supply chain with possible monopsony power. Now, the word monopsony may be new to you. Monopsony means a single buyer. Monopoly is a single seller. Monopsony, a single buyer. And sometimes if there is a single buyer of a product, the monopsonist, the single buyer, will have power because they're the only buyer of the product. No one else wants it. Nobody else can have it. So a monopsony means that they're able to bargain down the price of the product. So if a company is set up in a country that uses some local raw material, and it's the only company that's using that raw material, it has a monopsony power over the supply of that. It can dictate the price of the product. So larger corporations tend to have control over their supply chain, and sometimes they have monopsony power. They are the only buyer, and that gives them the power to determine the price of the product. Of course, they also benefit from global economies of scale, economies of size. As companies get bigger, their costs tend to become cheaper. They're able to negotiate better terms in the banks. They're able to have specialist machinery, specialist research and development, and so they're able to cut their costs as they get bigger. Of course, after a time, companies can get a little too big, so the costs start to rise. That's when you have diseconomies of scale. But large companies, generally speaking, can reap the benefits of economies of scale. Sometimes they can take a company which is, if you like, at an optimum size, it's at the best size, and then just duplicate it, build the same company or the same type of company in another country, so that it will also have an advantage. And perhaps it'll also be able to build on the knowledge and expertise of the original company. Corporate problems. Well, possible damage to the environment. As I said earlier, we live on a planet going around the sun. This is all we've got. And if we don't look after it, it won't be around for very long. Future generations will suffer. So if we think of, sometimes we move large amounts of commodities from one part of the world to the other. It just takes something to happen to have a major disaster. But also, as I said, there's the possible damage to the environment from our own behaviour. We're logging trees, for example. Trees put oxygen into the air. We breathe oxygen. We need it. We're knocking them down at a phenomenal rate because we have a demand for furniture and for wood and for paper, which means there won't be that facility, and the climate will be changed as well because the Amazon forests are important for climatic reasons. So we are damaging the environment. But in a sense, there's nothing we can do about it. We want more products. We want better standards of living, and there are more of us who want it. So how do we reconcile that extra demand against a depleting resource? There are pressures on renewable resources. Oil will run out. It's a finite resource. It's on the planet. We take it out of the ground. At some stage it will run out, by which time we will have burnt it, we will have used it up, and we will have polluted the atmosphere. So it's all very negative, unless there is something to come to the rescue, a new technology which is clean and efficient and we can all get to use. So climate change is an issue. We also have the exploitation of labour. I mentioned this earlier. Globalisation is encouraged by cheap labour. Let's be honest about it. We want cheap products and we want them coming in good quality, coming from reputable producers, but they're coming from sources where workers are not paid a lot. So the poor, in a sense, stay poor. Sometimes they come from areas where the workers have to work in sweatshops, work long hours under dangerous conditions with poor facilities. But the workers need their money just to subscribe and contribute towards the family. As far as we're concerned, perhaps, we just want cheap products. We got a bargain. Well, that bargain or that cheapness was probably at the cost of some poor individual in another country working long hours for almost little or nothing. There are bad working conditions. We have seen on television buildings collapse because they're badly designed and couldn't take the weight of having several factories at different levels in the building. So one building collapsed and many people were killed. It was reported on television. But there are dangerous working conditions in mines, there are dangerous working conditions on farms, dangerous working conditions all over. People try to cut costs. They cut costs so they can sell the product cheaper and sell more of the product. And consumers, of course, love it because they're getting it cheaper. But the people who are actually working may be in danger. There's poor health and diet. Because people are working long hours, it's not healthy. Sometimes they earn so little, they can only have small diets, and perhaps the diets are deficient in desirable ways in terms of protein or minerals or whatever. We even see children working long hours. And as I said earlier, we've seen this in this country in the 1800s and 1700s in the UK. But now it's happening on a global scale. People need children to contribute towards the running of the family. Otherwise, the family itself will perish. And when people get old, they are a burden on the family. So there are issues. There are economic problems as well. There is the development of global monopoly power. Some companies, when they're very successful and spread into other countries, eventually they become global monopoly. Eventually they're the only ones supplying that good or service. And any alternatives are bought up by the company or are competed away, or the company is able to suppress competition by its power, by its size. So we have global monopoly positions. There's also problems of economic stability, the banking crisis, for example. But the banking crisis, not just in 2010, it's been running for many years. Sometimes it's running without being properly recognized. Sometimes people hope that any crisis can be dealt with because there are, in a sense, technocrats and experts running those businesses, and they will ensure that it doesn't happen. But it does happen. And when it happens, a lot of people are affected. There's also possible damage to cultures as a consequence of international trade. We have global brands. Sometimes when we travel, we can see the same items in different countries. So there's no variation, there's no local changes. These are global brands that exist. And there's also, in a sense, global languages. English is the language of business. It's spoken right throughout the world. And there's a desire on the part of many people throughout the world to learn English, learn the English language, because it is the global language of business. But that means perhaps that indigenous languages are not going to develop, or they're not going to be used in some areas. Perhaps people will have two languages. They'll have the language spoken in the home and in the wider society, and they'll have a language at work, a business language. But you could say it damages the culture. On the other hand, you could see languages as a barrier to trade. If people cannot communicate, there will not be contact and there will not be trade, and there will be no advantages to the country from trade, because the people are not able to deal with the companies and able to trade. There is the loss of cultural diversity. Airports throughout the world seem to be all the same. They seem to have the same design, the same technologies, the same processes, and the same products seem to turn up at most airports. Hotels are standardized. They have a brand, and they seem to copy each other. There are many areas within many countries in which it is a global culture, not a local culture. There are other issues. Problem of accountability of global business. Who controls global business? Which country controls it? Perhaps the one with the headquarters? Well, some companies, they don't have a single headquarters. They have companies in different countries, and these companies are almost independent. They share ideas, they talk to each other, but they run quite separately. So who exactly controls the global businesses? Is there one point of control, or are all of these businesses under the control of national governments right throughout the world? Because some countries do not have regulations and do not have the same degree of control as perhaps many countries in the West. There's an increasing gap between rich and poor. This fuels the potential for terrorist reaction. Terrorism steps in when people are poor, because they fill the need. They fill it with whatever, with an ideology. And they're also aggressive towards countries that are successful, because they themselves feel that they're lacking, they're falling behind. So they feel aggressive, and it can fuel terrorism. At least that's one set of ideas that have been put forward to explain terrorism. Other explanations, of course, are being offered as well. There are issues of corporate social responsibility, pollution, poverty, genetically modified crops, GM crops. There are all sorts of issues that need to be addressed, and companies need to be aware that simply because they're living and working in another country doesn't give them carte blanche to behave as they wish. They need to take some responsibility for the pollution that they may be causing, or for some of their research and development if it's long-term injurious to a population. And there are efforts to remove trade barriers. These are ongoing. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, have negotiated for well, right back to the 1940s, into the 50s, to try and reduce trade barriers, to try and further increase the flow of trade and the flow of products and people across boundaries. So that's onward going, and it's likely to be the case that instead of globalization reaching a maximum and stopping, it's likely to continue. And it's likely to continue because governments want it, because international agencies are promoting it, because business want it. And I suppose out of what we got out of the previous slides is all of this is to be welcomed if the benefits of the trade can be spread throughout the poverty-stricken peoples of the world, and they get an education and food, and people are not expected to work for little or nothing in sweatshops. Because the benefits of globalization should not depend on poverty and depend on people desperate to try and feed their families, having to work long hours under dangerous conditions for very little money. The benefits of globalization should be technical rather than based on the exploitation of situations. It should be technical in the sense that it reaps economies of size, economies of scale, the same processes we expect in the West to be applied elsewhere. We have specialist machinery, good logistical systems, we have distribution networks, and they're done efficiently. And it's the efficiency with which we benefit, not the exploitation of our fellow man. These are some of the ideas that we can pick up on in globalization. Some of them are political, some of them are social, and we can't help but get involved with some of the things that we see on television, and get involved in the sense that we interpret the whole processes in the context of what we see. But it's an important area, and it's one that we should try to understand. It's also, as you can see, quite a long area to deal with, and it's important for you as a student of the subject to stop this video, go back to the start, do it again, stop it, make notes, do your own research, fill out your research, and try and do some background reading in the area. Get examples and make notes, and try and fit it into a structure that enables you to understand the whole process more fully. But that's all we're going to deal with here. I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to say Thank you for watching.